Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Cheryl Finley, and it's my great pleasure to join you this afternoon in this lunchtime live conversation with Lauren Tate Baeza, who's going to be coming on shortly. I just want to say hello to Hannah Ryan, hello to Lauren Harris, and to thank the AUC Art Collective team, Lauren Harris, Rachel Brown, our students, and the faculty in the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College, and also the Alice L. Walton Foundation. We are the AUC Art Collective, the first and only undergraduate program in the nation designed to train the next generation of African American students who will come in and disrupt and innovate the art world. So to go live now with Lauren Tate Baeza. Welcome, Lauren. I think you're about to jump on with us in just a minute. We're all connecting. Hello, how are you?
Hey, hey.
Good to see you. Okay, I think I need to move this a little bit. I'm slightly cut off here. Does that help? No, that doesn't help. Hold on. In my makeshift kitchen studio. So I'm really happy that we're having this conversation today, Lauren, and we have a lot to cover. We have so many things we want to talk about, but I want to begin first just by welcoming you and not pushing all the wrong buttons, welcoming you and to say that, you know, you have a really, really interesting career pathway. You are a curator, you are the director of exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is based in Atlanta. You're also the curator of the Martin Luther King Jr. collection at Morehouse College. You're also a geographer, and I love geographers. I love geography. I have always loved geography as a student, but I also think that increasingly when we think about, you know, technology and the work that we do in the field of arts, that technology related to how geography is used, GIS mapping, is so important and something that we as art historians and curators really need to take into account with what we do. You're also someone who is an Africanist and very interested in working with and has worked with NGOs in the past. And I think that in terms of looking at your career, I'd like to begin just by asking you if you could tell us about your work at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is an institution that we'd really like to know a lot more about.
Yeah, I think I'll start, before I talk about what I do there, I think I'll start by explaining what the center is for people who don't know.
So Lauren, your volume is low to me.
Is it?
I don't think it's my device, but if you can, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you so much.
Great. So I was saying that I think I'll start by just explaining what the center is for people who don't know before I talk about what I specifically do there. I'm going to talk about the center in a way that sort of describes it as two different entities in one. The first is a physical building. It is a museum or cultural attraction in downtown Atlanta that, through two incredible permanent exhibitions, tells the story of the American Civil Rights Movement, sort of in a narrow window, although a very important window, arguably a window that changed the world. And that
Lauren, when you say a narrow window, can you give us some dates
yes.
to define that, please?
Yeah, and that narrow window is 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. To 1968 with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And you go through the Civil Rights Gallery and sort of spits you out into our second permanent exhibition, which is called Spark of Conviction. And Spark of Conviction is a survey of more contemporary human rights movements around the world. I do want to say one more thing about the center, and that is that of all of the human and civil rights museums I've been to around the world, it has one really important point of distinction that I think has been very difficult to pull off at other institutions that are similar. And that point of distinction is that it has this ability to make people feel optimistic and empowered A lot of times museums that are about such a dark history and about atrocities, it really sort of opens up that atrocity and explains that atrocity and puts you in that moment. And that's hard to deal with. It's important history, and the reality of it is important, and I'm glad that some museums do that work. But our museum takes a different approach where it's looking at people first. And by people, I mean specifically heroes. So you learn on the back end about the things the reason they're heroes, right? You learn about the atrocities, but your introduction to those topics and sort of your way into learning about those atrocities is through people who overcame them. So you're starting with this sort of light idea. And the takeaway is that I can change things, that people do change things, as opposed to like despair. And there are somber moments in the museum for sure, but I think the takeaway is very uplifting. And sort of the final installation in the museum, the denouement, is this incredible film installation that is like bright and colorful and sonic, and it's got choreographed multiple screens, and it really sort of pulls everything together, where it's implied elsewhere in the center that we're one shared human community, and as such we have an obligation to care for oppression wherever it's happening in the world. It's really not implied in that space. It's very apparent, and the way that it's designed is that.
So, I was going to say, you're pointing to a couple of really interesting things, especially when you talk about that last piece that's a multimedia piece where we're immersed. But you began by saying that there's a difference in the way that you tell the story, that you put people first. And I'm wondering if there are also ways in which in doing so, in putting people first, that you're also in the process of teaching people how they can always be first, how they can be themselves change agents, because it sounds like that might be part of maybe like a subliminal, message that's being sort of shared throughout the entire exhibition.
Yes, very deliberately so, yeah. And I think, again, secondly, and equally importantly, this idea of shared global community, just that you should care about injustices that are maybe outside of your group.
Right.
And because it is all one shared sort of monster, right? If you let oppression grow and become stronger and systemic in one area, then it will eventually just be better at doing the same to you. Right. So those are kind of the two big takeaways, I think, from the center.
Okay.
Okay. And then the other thing we do, that's just the one part, as I said, I'm going to put this into two, is advocacy work. And we do that in a lot of different ways. We have, for some time now, had two sort of think tanks under our umbrella. One is the International Institute for Human Trafficking and the Lgbtq Institute. The Institute for Human Trafficking, it really addresses the problem of sex and labor exploitation, and it does something a little bit different from other organizations that are similar. Those organizations look more at the traffickers themselves, whereas the campaigns under our institute are really looking at the purchasers, the predators who are buying sex from children, or the people who buy labor to exploit and keep vulnerable populations trapped in labor.
There was one piece that you discussed with me yesterday about this particular think tank that looks at human trafficking, that I found really, really salient, especially for those of us who are on this lunchtime conversation today who've ever been through Hartsfield International Airport.
Yes.
And I wanted you to maybe share that, because that makes it makes the really important work that you're doing, as you said, the salient work that you're doing, something that we can kind of really quantify, that's very, very tangible.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just about to say that. The other thing I think they do especially well is an awareness campaign, so that reporting goes up. And I think one of the best examples of that is exactly what you said. If you've ever been in Hartsfield Jackson Airport and been on the subway that takes you kind of from concourse to concourse, there's a recording that tells you what to look out for. And it's really just impactful. And every time I'm on that train, I just feel so proud of the place I work. That's all that institute's labor. And they've done numerous other things, but that one is something I think a lot of people that are watching have perhaps experienced before.
Right. And so could you tell us something more about, in terms of thinking, especially when we talked about, this particular think tank, there was a way that from your own experience and some of the work that you've done, and also some of what you've been reading recently, you told me that you're reading Women in Migrations, which is, amazing. So I'd like to know a little bit more about, your experience with that book. This is a book that was co-edited by Kalia Brooks Nelson, Ellen Toscano, and Deborah Willis, based on a series of convenings of scholars, artists, performers, writers, on grappling with the issues of women in migration, and also thinking about, this is another conversation that we had about, the really important role of geography and GIS, and thinking about, diasporas, and thinking about how we might use migration, the fact of people moving from one place to the next, whether voluntarily or forcibly, how we can use migration as a tool of analysis, right? So that we can think about that as sort of as a theoretical tool to sort of intervene in the way that we think about curatorial practice, or the way that we might think about teaching art history, instead of having art history as a discipline that might be periodized, that is, thought about over certain time periods over the history of the world, but also considering how we might think about art history as something that might not even be one that is a sort of divided by regions in the world, instead of thinking about migration as a way to connect those different regions, and to think, I think, in a more interdisciplinary and connected way in terms of teaching art history.
Yeah, I'm reading that book for my own personal interest. An incredible artist named Tracy Murrell convened a group of 6 women. We're all Black women, and it's 2 curators, 2 artists, and 2 filmmakers. And we read chapters from this book, and we share our interpretations. As a geographer, of course, migrations is interesting to me, but the fact that these chapters are, contributions by art historians and artists is especially of interest, because I think that creativity is a way of thinking. It is interesting to see people who are in the art world, I guess, analyze problems that are thought of generally as beyond the art world's scope. So the book has been incredible. It's been an incredible intersection of all kinds of ideas in every discipline. And the conversations that we have as women are often very emotional and personal. And we've all become really good friends through the process of reading this book. Some of us didn't know each other at all when we started to convene around this book. And now we're all, we all know each other very well.
Right, right. And it's just so nice to know that, a text like that, which was a collective, group of people getting together, that it can bring you together with your sister scholars. And I also wanted to share just with everyone who's here that we'll be convening beginning next month, which is only a week away, on June 3rd, another sort of online version gathering of women in migrations that everyone is invited to join. This is sponsored by NYU Washington, NYU Tisch School of the Arts, convened by Ellen Toscano, Deborah Willis, and myself on Wednesdays. Every Wednesday in the month of June at 1 p.m. we'll be having conversations, and these are global conversations. As you well know, there are many of us who have been sheltering in place, stuck in place in different parts of the world, unintentionally so. So we'll have scholars joining us from, like I said, just about everywhere, and artists and writers, and also policymakers, to kind of think about, how we might consider policy as part of this conversation. as well, not just crisis. But I want to get back to sort of this moment that we're in, the moment that, sort of pushed us to this particular format as a way to interact with our multiple communities. And you began by saying that the Center for Civil and Human Rights, National Center for Civil and Human Rights, I have to remember the national, but that, it has these two different arms. You have the physical building where you have the exhibition space, where you're able to also invite in school groups and others to educate them, and also to, in a sense, give these very specialized tours to, but also you have the advocacy arm. Now, what has happened? What is different at this National Center for Civil and Human Rights as a result of the current pandemic? What areas are still functioning? What areas are sort of being reimagined as a result?
Yeah, and also I want to say I think we got really excited about, you loved that story I shared with you yesterday about the airport. I think we got excited about the human trafficking arm, and I didn't really finish speaking about the advocacy we currently do, so I'll wrap this all together. I mentioned the Lgbtq Institute, and what it does is it looks at LGBTQ issues in the Southeast. Apparently, only about 2% of nationally funded LGBTQ research looked at the South. And so it's really important that we have this institution that's sort of fixing that problem and doing more research, because as we know, comprehensive research results in productive policy change. We do D&I trainings, we do special tours and lectures for rookie police officers. We have an initiative around health and human rights. And then we had a couple of things in the queue before COVID, and we've had to pivot, which I'll talk about. But the things we had in the queue were also very exciting. And they were a campaign that looks at facilitating some sort of reconciliation regarding America's history and legacy of violence against Black bodies. So that was a really exciting campaign we were getting ready to gear up for before the COVID shutdown. So hopefully we can get back focused on that, because as we've seen in the news recently,
I was going to say,
that is an ongoing
that has
problem.
to be, I'm assuming that's going to be something that'll go right back to yesterday.
And I don't even use the phrase lynching anymore. I just use violence against Black people.
Right, right. The daily violence.
Let's get out of the nuances and just talk about state violence and vigilantes. And then the last thing.
It's so much built into, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but it's so much built into the structure, right? That daily violence, that numbing daily violence, it's built into structural racism and structural disenfranchisement.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that was in the queue is an advocacy institute, where we look forward to training advocates, being an advocate for advocates, giving them some tools and strategies for how to lead a successful campaign, so that everyday citizens can participate more effectively in democracy. I'm not necessarily the most patriotic person in the world, but I love and I'm grateful that I live in a country where we can dissent. I can say, I don't like my president, and I'm not going to disappear. And so that Advocacy Institute is built around getting people to exercise all of those freedoms. And so those were some things in the queue that are kind of question mark right now. Since the shutdown, we have sort of put on hold the museum and building part of what we do, and we're amplifying all of the sort of advocacy and campaigning that we've been known for, and will probably, in my opinion, be most known for over time in the immediate future. But I can imagine over the next 10 years, that the Center for Civil and Human Rights will be well known nationally for its advocacy work. The first thing that we're launching under sort of our restructuring and refocusing all on advocacy is a campaign called the Campaign for Equal Dignity. And that campaign will launch officially on Monday, June 1st. It is a response to COVID and sort of all of the structural inequities, as you mentioned, Cheryl, that have been laid bare because of COVID, and where the stakes are especially high because of COVID. People are dying in a more immediate way, or people are getting sick in a more immediate way. And as we've seen, this is showing up in communities that always are disproportionately impacted when it comes to health, death, education, as in poor education, and so forth. So,
and you also mentioned with the Campaign for Equal Dignity that there are ways in which this campaign is especially looking at, at policy, policy as it affects disparity with regards to access to healthcare, and policy too that I think would draw upon your experience as someone who works with geography, to think about how certain populations can be targeted with this new think tank.
Yeah, I mean, the think tank isn't necessarily organized around populations as such. It has 5 sort of key areas that it's looking at. It's looking at one, access to an equal education. It's looking at economic security. It's looking at health equity, which is something, again, we're well versed in because we already have an initiative for health as a human right. It's looking at the right to vote because it's an election year and that's especially important right now, especially with COVID, and we're monitoring the kinds of restrictions that people are going to have to face, which they were already going to have to face, and we were already planning to engage voting rights this year, and now it's another very serious restriction. And so another layer of complications to voting, rather. And then lastly, under-resourced communities. So we're just looking at those 5 topics and hoping to, amplify the work of advocates that are working around those 5 areas. And that is probably our priority. And then the second, I would say, most important thing that this campaign aims to do is to get people to make a pledge that these things are important to them, and that what we will do with the information once people make a pledge is send them more data and ways to get involved around these issues so that they can take action. This is still very much being developed. We're going to launch it and we're going to try a lot of different things, and this is what we're doing for the rest of the year. So I think a lot of things are still in development. I know that when we have our meetings, people are open to ideas, and we'll probably try a lot of different things. There may be creative elements. There will likely be a lot of social media activations where we ask people to post what, I don't know, what dignity means to them, for example. And there's a lot of creative ideas on the table, and there's a lot of positive reception to the ideas that people present in our meetings. So I think this will take on a lot of different incarnations while we sort it out and see what resonates. It's difficult to say officially what everything will look like right now.
Right. And you said that's going to be launching tomorrow, correct?
It's actually launching Monday.
Monday, okay.
Monday.
All right, so if if you have a website to draw us to, if you could please share that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Right now, I don't know if
yes.
you have that now.
It's equaldignity.org.
Okay.
It'll be equaldignity.org.
Great.
And it's not live yet, but just make a note of it and check in, and that's what the center plans to do, at least for the rest of the year, and perhaps ongoing, but especially now while we are not physically open.
So one of the things I wanted to go back to, and this is again thinking about equal dignity, and also your work as director of exhibitions, your work as a curator, your seasoned work as a curator. I wanted to ask, and you alluded to this a little bit, but how do you think equal dignity, or how you begin to sort of fold in the kind of work that you do as a curator and director of exhibitions into equal dignity, if for all intents and purposes, the physical space of the building that you occupy is not one that we're going to have access to throughout the rest of the calendar year due to the pandemic. You mentioned the ways that perhaps social media might be harnessed for this project, but
Cheryl?
Yes.
I'm gonna run and get my charger. I just don't want my phone to die. I can hear you, but I didn't want you to see me step away and wonder where.
Okay, cool. No, I got it. That's fine. So one of the people who is with us here, Art Loving Gary's, if I can get it right, I don't really know who that is, but I probably should know who that is, said that For Freedoms has actually done some of this kind of work. And I know especially with that project, which was a project that erected billboards throughout the 50 states leading up to the 2016 election. To really get us to think about what freedom means, what the right to vote means, that kind of work was a way to really put before people in a very public way, and these kinds of issues. And I'm wondering just if you've had a chance to think about how you as a curator might be doing some of the work to sort of bring, you know, a visual image to the Equal Dignity Initiative.
I certainly hope so. Like I said, I think we're still, you know, sorting out all the details of what this campaign will look like in practice. But I would love to fold in a community of creatives around these 5 pillars that I mentioned previously. Again, we're still developing it, but that certainly is something that is a part of the conversations, at least on my end.
Right. Okay, great. And so I also see here one of the comments that that For Freedoms is continuing to do the work that that they have begun, which was actually for the midterms, and they're continuing to do that work. So maybe there's a way that you all can partner together. So I want to also go back to just you and, you know, your training. And I would love to hear if you could share with us some of the kind of work that you've done, either with the MLK collection at Morehouse or the other work that you've done in your own training at UCLA, just to give at least those of us who are still students, myself included, just different avenues to think about how we can do the work that we're passionate about, how we can do the work that is really going to affect change and to make the art world and the world a different place to be.
Just to chat a little bit about myself, I think it's important, especially because of your audience and the initiatives over at the AUC right now in terms of the Art Collective, to sort of go back further than I normally do when I give my spiel about who I am, and talk about the fact that when I came out of high school and was gearing up to go to college, I really wanted to study art history, and my parents didn't get it. They were just like, what is that? And then I was like, well, what about art education? They're like, no. Art therapy? They're like, no. And it was really disruptive for me because my parents were incredibly supportive of every creative pursuit. I went to an arts high school. They were at every play. I mean, they got me private voice lessons for singing. I had studied ballet pretty much off and on since I was 2. And they were always very encouraging of that. My dad took me to all of my first art museums. So I was very confused. And I think that that's very common for immigrant, you know, first generation kids, and for African Americans whose parents feel like you better take a safe bet, you know, study business, you know, study finance. You already have to be a woman. You already have to be Black.
Doctor, lawyer.
Right, be a doctor.
Or
right,
engineering.
They're like, that was cute in high school, but you have to go get a job. And there's just no real understanding of all of the options for employment in museum space and in the art world among a lot of people of a previous generation. And there's a lot of fear that comes out of their absolute love for you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so I actually the only thing my parents, and I think Lauren Jackson Harris and I have almost the exact same story. The only thing my parents kind of bought into was graphic design. They were like, that's totally, you're going to have a job. Yeah. You know, they saw all the stats, you know, this is like the late 90s. So, you know, it was incredibly, you know, exciting and growing field then. It wasn't as common for someone to have that degree. And they thought that was very logical. I hated graphic design. I never had interest in it, and I just did it because it was like the only thing tangentially related to art that they approved of. And so what ended up happening is I dropped out of school. And some people, you know, probably would have done differently and like just picked whatever major they loved, or, you know, rebelled or double majored or something. But I was just so distraught. I was someone that felt like it was really important that my parents approved of what I did. Mm-hmm. And so I went into a field I knew I didn't like, and inevitably it didn't work.
And so did you then go to graduate school? Because I want to say I had a similar path, in that when I know when I applied to college, I couldn't say, it was the same thing. I couldn't say that I wanted to be an actor. That's what I wanted to do. Okay. I wanted to be the star of stage and screen.
Oh my goodness.
Be an actor. And I couldn't do that. I had to be a doctor or a lawyer, and so, or a dentist, right? And maybe, I don't think I even knew what an engineer was then. My sister graduated from Spelman, chemical engineer and chemistry major, dual degree program. And my mother understood that, right? But,
Happy.
you know, when I think about my application to college, I applied and said that I was going to be a doctor. And I think I got like I know what grade I got in chemistry. So they did not buy that, you know, certain schools did not buy that. But, you know, when I finished, the first job I had was actually working as, and I took some art classes. I wasn't an art or art history major. I dropped out of doing a lot of the performing arts work that I did as a dancer and an actor because we were at Howard University Children's Theater in DC, you know, through high school. But then I went to a predominantly white all women's college, Wellesley, in the North, and just that feel for acting and dancing was very different. Long and short of it is, my first job out, I was a curator for a private collector who had purchased a collection of Berenice Abbott, an American photographer, and that was my first position for 3 years. For that entire 3-year period, my mother, you know, would think of my position as an internship. It wasn't actually like a real job. So that transition, I think it's really something that we are working very hard at the AUC Art Collective to dispel, the transition between our parents understanding what we might be passionate about can actually be a job. It can be a career. It can actually be really quite lucrative.
Right.
If you think about, you know, the kinds of salaries that people who work in the museum world, even in art and art history, in the professoriate, can command.
Absolutely. So I dropped out of school. I never finished a graphic design degree or anything, and didn't go back to school for some years. And when I went back, you know, it's different then. You're an adult. You've got your own life. No one's telling you, you know, your parents, they accept that you're an adult now a little bit better than when you're like applying for college at 16 or 17 years old. And so I went back initially intending to study art history as I originally wanted, because that passion never went anywhere. And actually the program I was looking at the time, it isn't where I ended up finishing my undergraduate degree. But their art history course offerings didn't satisfy me. They had, I think, one course that was on Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Like, they had one course on 2 whole continents, and the rest of the coursework was very much on American art and European art.
Right.
And it was nuanced, and it was, you know, art from specific eras and specific centuries, and religious art and art commissioned by royals. And it was interesting. It just felt like it was limiting, and I always had an interest in African history, and I wanted more coursework that let me sort of, through objects and material culture, explore African history and culture, and I couldn't get that. So I ended up switching to an interdisciplinary major, Africana Studies, and I completed my undergraduate education at a really wonderful program at California State University, Northridge.
Fantastic.
Which is like, I think it is it's not technically on paper, but it is the first Africana Studies program in the country. I think San Francisco beat it because the mayor...
No, it was at Cornell. I mean, at least that's what we're told.
Okay.
Yeah, it was at Cornell.
Well, maybe of the state schools, public universities. I think some politics happened where there was a mayor in Los Angeles at the time that did not want to have that program, so they had to wait until his tenure ended to officially have the program at Northridge. But in the meantime, one started in San Francisco.
And I would believe that too, because all of the ethnic studies programs started definitely at San Francisco in the late 1960s. So for sure.
Yeah. And some of those student protesters that were responsible for getting that program at Cal State Northridge were my professors.
Wow.
And so it was incredible to go to school with people who were not just incredible scholars and academics in theory, but also had all this applied experience and all these incredible offerings in terms of grassroots organizing. And some of them had worked for the UN and the African Union. And it was a very Pan-African program, which is what I was looking for. I didn't want to just get the African American story.
Right.
Because any story that starts with slavery is incomplete to me. So I loved my program there, and it was wonderful. And I had a cultural studies emphasis, and interned at Santa Monica Museum of Art, which is now the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. And for about 2 years, did bi-monthly public programs at the Fowler Museum, which was transformative for me. It's still one of my favorite museums in the country. And really sort of was gearing up to have a professional career in museums, but took a little bit of a break, which now I don't think of as a break, and got into politics more. I'd always been, of course, as I just mentioned, interested in the stories that objects tell and what kind of social and political nuances are revealed by both contemporary art and past material culture, more practical material culture, religious objects and things like that. And was always sort of writing about the political implications. But I had
Speaking of writing, you have a new piece of writing that's out in Art Papers.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Check out the spring article of Art Papers. It's on art in the new civil rights era. It's an incredible issue. It's a beautiful issue too. It's well designed. It's got really powerful pieces in it. I think you've had a couple of people on, Cheryl.
Yes, T.K. Smith. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're all proud of it. Check it out. I hope that it becomes, no pressure Art Papers, but I hope
the new standard.
I hope that this is a series. I hope that maybe there's another one or something, because there's so much to say about the topic. I think I was saying that I just had some really incredible mentors in my undergraduate program who, while I was always looking at the political implications of art, really loved my scholarship and wanted me to do, political research in a more immediate way, and really gave me a lot of guidance and persuaded me to pursue things, looking at a career with, the Department of State or with multilateral organizations that they'd worked for. A lot of them, again, had worked for the AU or the UN. And when I went to grad school, I was really looking more in that way. I was looking more in that through the lens of post-colonial African political history and less directly looking at art and museum practice. And so the result of that is that I ended up working for a couple of NGOs for a while before sort of landing back in the museum space. I don't know how much time we have, but I would love to just say really quickly that
we've got 20 minutes.
Okay.
We've got 20 minutes, and I want you to know, and everyone, and that's like the collective you that's all joining us here. I think we already know, Lauren, that we're going to have another conversation. We'll have more conversations. Maybe this will become a series just between the two of us. But we have so much that we did want to share. But I want you to know, Lauren, that that your path is so important to know about, and it's something that I know our students and listeners are very interested in. And it's also a path that I think is a model when I think about the kind of work that we want to do, which is work that really changes the way not only the field of art history, but also the art world operates. So to be able to, as we started out talking in the beginning of the call, to think about sort of migration as a tool of analysis, or to how, when we think about, we had this conversation yesterday, how the field of African art has been completely changed and is continually being changed, by Black voices, which were not part of the conversation when the field was something that was thought of and brought into being through a lot of work that was done around European colonialism, right, and plunder. So just thinking about how voices that have this multi sort of valent experience and multivalent area of interest that can really think about changing the field, and also just thinking about putting new frames of analysis on it.
Absolutely. And I said earlier, I thought of it as a break, but it really is. It informs everything I do, and I feel like I'm a curator because I went and did this work in Africa. The thing I was asking if I had time about that I was going to say really quickly is that It was very difficult for me, unfortunately, to find NGOs that I aligned with my belief system. And what I mean by that is that they weren't paternalistic and just colonialism by another name.
Right.
To be quite frank, I just want to take a moment because I think that there are a lot of incredible, well-meaning people who give their funds with the best of intentions to NGOs, multilateral institutions, their church-based groups, or faith-based of any kind groups, and they trust these institutions to do good work. And unfortunately, I don't think that a lot of the institutions working on the continent are good custodians of that money. And so I had to do a bit of digging around to find organizations, and I'm honored to have worked with incredible organizations that prioritized working collaboratively with communities, even in terms of what the problem is, as opposed to going over with our Western biases about the problems we think we see, asking the community, what do you want? Rather than spending plane ticket dollars on sending 17-year-olds over to, Haiti and Africa and South America and the Pacific Islands to hold babies and call it their, community service, even though they have no skills whatsoever. Right? Because you're a 17 American kid, you don't have real skills. You could have spent that money, empowering people who already are working towards solving problems in their own communities. And so
and just by asking questions.
Absolutely.
By asking, what do you want and how do we collaborate?
100%.
What do you need?
And I think we were really clear with the organizations that I happened to work with that what our expertise was and what we had to offer was our privilege and access to the West, right? So I felt like it was my job to listen to the community and then be the translator that knows how to speak the language of scalability and to quantify all the data that I found in the community to make sure that I got funding for the problem that they told me they wanted to solve. And that practice, I absolutely use as a curator. The practice of listening and being culturally, we have a professional obligation to be culturally accurate, and we have a moral obligation to be culturally sensitive. And I learned that work through working with NGOs.
So this is something I wanted you to maybe touch upon, and then, there are like two things I wanted to ask, and then maybe we can go back. And I want to say to everyone too, if you have questions, please pose them in the question function. But, can you talk about the collaborative process that you gained from your work in NGOs, just from your career path, and how that relates to your belief in having a collaborative process in the curatorial realm? That's one question. And then I want to pivot back to thinking about, reparation of African art objects, which is one of the topics that we wanted to get to today that we might only have a chance to touch upon lightly. But I think it relates to some of our conversations that we had about NGOs and about some of the work that certain NGOs are doing around this particular issue.
In terms of my process, and I think I'll tie into migrations a little bit. There was an exhibition that we were going to open at the center, and I was working with an incredible team on the girls over at Rabbit Raccoon. That was going to be on the U.S.-Mexico border crisis.
Can you say what Rabbit Raccoon is? For those
Rabbit Raccoon is they're two women, they're partners, and they create incredible film work. They've also done curatorial projects, and they really engage social justice and creative expression. And the work they've done is incredible. I won't spend too much time on it. Google. The woman that I was working with of the two partners most closely was Gabriella Art. She has an incredible website that really gives you sort of a comprehensive view of the projects she's worked on and the impact that her creative projects have had. And I really climbed over hot coals to get them to, in my meetings with my team, to make sure that they were the people that I could work with for this exhibit. Unfortunately, again, because of COVID, it's been it's not happening. There would be, and even if it were happening, there'd be no body in the building to see it. But
so I have to say something, Lauren. So I don't know if it's Ann Collins Smith, is it Makiba Dixon Hill, is it Andrea Barnwell Brownlee? I'm not sure who just said this at the Spelman College Museum, but she said we were so looking forward to that show. And now you and I talked about it yesterday, but now I remember hearing about the show in the fall because I too was looking forward to it.
Of course.
We had it
You're
on
the
one
migrations
of our monthly events. We were actually planning to go to the show.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I would have loved to see you guys there. Shout out to Spelman Museum. You guys are wonderful. I love the women over at the Spelman Museum. All of you are incredible. It's one of my favorite museum spaces in the city. It's not hyperbolic. It might be my favorite.
It's the best.
Sorry, other museums. Yeah, so we were working on that, and so just to give a real case study of how I apply this stuff in practice, for that exhibition, as an African American woman who did not specialize in I don't know, the border or Latin American politics or any of that. No matter how much I am my own private scholar and dig around and do a lot of research, I'm still not an authority on that. I'm an Africanist. And so I assembled a team, an advisory team of people who work on this stuff every single day. So there were, people who are, pro bono asylum lawyers, people who establish law clinics specifically to address this issue, experts in what's happening in Georgia, but also experts in what's happening at the border because they're there all the time, consulting and doing oversight projects and working with an incredible team. I think we had about 10 people on our advisory committee. The first brainstorm session or charrette that I had them in the room, again, to make sure that we are being thorough. And of course, in an exhibition, you only have a certain amount of space to tell a story, but you start off, as all curators know, with a whole lot more information than you're eventually going to put out on display. Responsive to the questions that you'll get when the exhibition goes up. You need to be able to really be able to speak to all of the work on the wall in a nuanced way. And so we were working on that, and that is again sort of a skill set that I was able to develop working in NGOs and just consulting with communities and elders and experts outside of my own expertise. I think sometimes there might be a little bit of a feeling of ownership and possession that keeps people from doing that. They're like, am I still the curator? Am I still the curator if I'm getting all this instruction from other people? Yes, because you're making selections about which pieces you're presenting. It just makes you better at your job, in my opinion.
Right. And you're bringing everyone together. I mean, that's something about the collaborative process.
Right.
Yeah.
So did that answer your question as an
Oh,
example
totally.
of how I
No,
apply
it was great. And I'm so happy just to, remember that was a show that I too was looking forward to, and just kind of thinking about tying that together with some of the programming that we had at the AUCR Collective in the fall, and also, again, my own interest in migrations. And Dr. Deborah Willis curated an exhibition that was at MICA in Baltimore this past spring on migrations as well. So I think there's a lot of collaboration that we're going to be doing in the future.
I hope so.
Around that, yeah.
I was going to say, whether it's with, and I've already talked to, some of these people on the committee that I had assembled, and Rabbit Raccoon. Some of the people are all very much still interested in executing on this. And whether it is in the center or elsewhere, I plan on doing something with all the research we've done and all the community building we've done, and hope that happens again one way or the other.
Yeah, definitely.
Cheryl.
Okay. Yeah.
Are we going to co-curate something?
Yes, we are. Yes, no, for sure. We are. We will. Let's do it. Because the other part, okay, this is the last piece on migration. I've been working with Lee Rayford at Berkeley, who was on a couple of weeks ago, and Heike Raphael Hernandez, who's at Würzburg in Germany, on another migration project. We have a published article about our work that focuses around the migration crisis in the Mediterranean. And so that's something that, as you and I had spoken about, and that I really want to do, that's something that I'd love to be able to kind of look at, migration in this comparative way. So not to just look at only the U.S.-Mexico border or only U.S.-Caribbean borders or U.S.-African borders, but also to bring in some of the other issues in the Mediterranean as well. So I see there's a question waiting, but before I get to the question, I would like to ask you if we have 9 minutes, which probably means we have like 8 minutes and something seconds. If we can maybe shift to thinking about, reparation of African art objects. We were also supposed to talk about equity, but I think that's, again, something that we can map onto the question of reparation too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you have a question or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I had a question. This is kind of getting back to what we spoke about yesterday, but to a question maybe around some of the work that you've done in this area, and especially you referenced, I think, a conference that you've gone to in Tanzania, and some of the work where you said that it's been your experience that it's not necessarily. It's not just about the objects. Okay, well, give me back my object that you stole,
Right.
in that battle 150 years ago.
No.
Give me back my objects that are part of our cultural heritage and practice, but rather they're larger questions that have to do with political economies. And political economies that have been created as a result of certain historical functions, whether or not we talk about, the history of colonialism, or whether or not we talk about even other more recent, say, like if we look at the problems in the Middle East, we can talk about, the African continent and African objects, but we can also talk about, more recent examples in the Middle East, in places like Afghanistan and obviously Iraq, and the looting of cultural objects.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting about this, well, there's a few things I think are really interesting about this. One is the timing. Why now? Why is this becoming such a hot conversation at the moment? And some of the answers implied. Second thing that I think is really, before we unpack that, a second thing that I think is really interesting about it is there's an infrastructure for this. You kind of touched on it. UNESCO has had this, convention on illicit trafficking of cultural property since 1970. And in the UN, just speaking of political institutions, kind of started this conversation right after World War II in response to war. I mean, that's what the UN does. It responds to war and human rights issues.
Right.
And so they're speaking sort of specifically about like the looting and raiding that happens when places are unstable. So right now, if you go to like the website that manages that at the UN, they're talking about Syria, they're talking about Afghanistan, they're still talking about things looted in a contemporary context around war. But they do have this, so they're not going back far enough for us in terms of, repatriation of objects that were taken during colonialism. But what they do offer is, I think, a really great language for why it's important, and some great mechanisms for ways to return, and some really, some good groundwork in terms of, international cooperation. I think they're doing a really good job at returning things that they're finding on the black market in one country to the country of origin, and doing their due diligence in terms of looking at provenance paperwork and asking countries, is this missing, before they just let it go through their customs? Did you intend to sell this, kind of thing? And so I think there's a model that just needs to be applied to this
500 years ago?
right. And so when I think of it in that way, I think it's not that hard. But it is going to be, of course, very difficult, as we've discussed, Cheryl, because especially when we're talking about European institutions, because those institutions are government institutions. And so now we're talking about not just, a public ceremonial symbolic apology, but an apology in action. Mm-hmm. This is a broader sort of reparations, decolonial reconciliation
issue.
in action, right? Not just
Yeah.
not just a statement. That
Right. And it also relates to policy, which is something else that we talked about.
Absolutely. So I think it's exciting that it's being discussed, and I think that we have our work cut out for us. I think it's for all the people that have a stake in this. I want to tell us all to strap on our seatbelts because it is going to be a long, complicated, multi-layered debate. Necessarily so. I think good policy is hard. So if you're consulting with all the parties you need to consult with, then that's not easy. And that's okay. And that,
Right.
and as I said to you multiple times, Cheryl, that something is hard is not a reason to not do it.
Of course.
And I think that
reason to do it.
Right. I think we hear a lot of people who are opposed to repatriation sort of talking about how hard it's going to be and how it's impossible. And like, I can't go through Providence documents for my whole African collection. And yes, you can. It's just going to take a while. Like, let's get some funding together.
Well, one of my working groups is actually using blockchain to do this provenance tracking. So yes, it is so possible, especially by using more contemporary technologies. So blockchain, that's going to be another conversation that we'll be having at a lunchtime live session coming up. But definitely, seriously, that is one way to do it.
Right.
So looking at the clock, we've got about 2 minutes left, and I did want to pose the question, which I think is a great one, and you began to talk about this. This question is, I'd love to hear more about curatorial opportunities outside of art museums. Could you talk about how you arrived at the Center for Civil and National Center for Civil and Human Rights? So you've talked about that a lot in terms of your career path, but did you think that you would be there? Do you think about your work as curating within an art museum, even though you're in an institution that has sort of the exhibition space and sort of policy advocacy arm?
Yeah, so my return to museums was really deliberate, and I think it was because I kind of looked up, and it had been 7 years or so, and I think the museum world changed. I think, it's changed a lot in the last 20 years, but especially in the last 10. And where I used to feel like there was this polarity within myself where I had to pick between politics and art and museums, I didn't feel that way anymore. Museums had become, art is always political, but it had become more vocal and deliberate in its the social and political implications of the exhibitions on display. And perhaps more importantly, they'd become these important, incredible sites for community dialogue and a new sort of type of programming. Right. And that was super exciting. I was like, oh, I can do all of this at once. I don't have to keep bouncing around from contemporary art museums to working at NGOs in Uganda. I can do these things in one space. I can have these conversations in one space that I do believe have very tangible political and social impacts, especially in localities. So I went back because I felt like it was no longer something that I had to pick between. I felt like I could finally do both.
That's great.
And perhaps more easily in institutions that were, history museums and museums of human rights where I found myself. But we do art as well. One of the things, I feel like my job is sort of broken into three things. I curate the King Papers, which is Morehouse College's collection. I'm a sort of collections manager for the Allen Littlefield collection, which I know you're familiar with, Cheryl. We should come back and talk about that.
which is so we have 1 minute and 15 seconds left. So I'll say in a nutshell, that's a collection of real photo postcards of the documents the history of lynching in the United States. But what's the third thing?
And the third thing is that as a director of exhibitions, I have the incredible opportunity to work with all kinds of creative partners to do temporary exhibitions in the space. And so I've worked with Sheila Prebright. We've worked with Art for Amnesty to bring Peter Cease's tapestries to the center. We've
30 seconds.
We've worked with Oculus Facebook. We've worked with Jessica Caldas and Living Melody Collective to bring very creative displays. So we're trying to do both the quote unquote art and the history at the same time.
Right. Okay, so Lauren, could you please tell us the website again for the Equal Dignity Initiative?
It's going to be equaldignity.org, and it will be up and running on Monday.
On Monday. Okay, great. That will be June 1st. Thank you so much for joining us with Lauren Tate Baeza at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.